everybody, and welcome back to the Goot Reaction. I'm your host, Joe Goot, and with me is my man from the Midwest. This week, we're going to be talking about the brain and free will. We started off this discussing this topic by listening to a couple episodes from the Armchair Expert Show, which is Dax and Monica's podcast, which is a pretty awesome show, and they do all different kinds of episodes, but the ones that really speak to us tend to be the ones where they interview amazing experts in their respective fields. And the two episodes that we're talking about that really kicked off our brains on this one are the Robert Sapolsky episode and the Max Bennett episode. So the Max one was just within the last week or so, and the Robert Sapolsky one was, I believe, earlier this summer. And with Robert Sapolsky, if you don't know about him, he is an expert in the field of studying baboons, actually, funny enough. And he spent like 30 plus years in the field studying baboons. And his main research was around like stress response, how they interact as a community, what the hierarchy looks like in that environment. And he's written books like Behave and Determined are probably his two most well-known works. And he's a funny guy, just sort of one of those polymaths that's just good at everything and a really, really smart guy. And his argument in this particular podcast that we listened to was around free will. And he starts talking about his baboon research and other things, but then leads to his ultimate conclusions about free will, which we'll get to in a little bit. And then the Max Bennett episode, they were discussing his book called A Brief History of Intelligence. And he has his theories on essentially the 5 stages of intelligent development in the brain. And then he also, in the book and in the show, discusses how that pertains to AI and machine learning and other things as well. So what humans do trying to replicate evolutionary intelligence. And so some of those 5 stages are, in a quick summary here, essentially from the development of the nervous system to better navigation and movement, the memory system, the role of language, and finally the ability to understand others' thoughts and feelings. So basically empathy. And so between those 2 episodes, we just got to thinking about, again, free will. We've had plenty of discussions by ourselves, just around free will and the role of the development of the brain and how that might impact your ability to make decisions and the ramifications in the legal field, and whether you should be praised for your accomplishments or whether those things are just part of your evolutionary makeup, part of that nature versus nurture thing. With that being said, we're going to go through some of the foundational building blocks of Sapolsky's argument, particularly. Max Bennett has, again, a great show with him as well. His topic was a little more technical and very complex, so it's a little bit harder to summarize. But basically, why we wanted to include that was because he got us from the beginning with single-cell organisms all the way up to empathy and language in modern human brains. So he really laid the foundation of how we got from the smallest organisms and then developing nervous systems and all the way up to, again, like I said, empathy and language and so forth. So we won't spend too much time on that. But Sapolsky basically gets us from that point, from the point of the modern brain, to making his conclusions on free will. So we're going to focus on Sapolsky's arguments specifically. And of course, as always, on the way there, we're going to branch off, go down a bunch of rabbit holes, I'm sure, and we'll discuss our own feelings on free will. So to start off, he started laying the groundwork with stress and stress hormones and how they can lead to anxiety disorders. And basically, you've got the two main, most interesting parts of the brain are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And it turns out that the more stress hormones you have in your body, the more your amygdala grows. And the amygdala is, of course, the part of your brain. That's what we call the crocodile brain, the ancient brain, one of the first parts to exist as the brain evolved. And that's the piece that controls fear and your flight or fight response. And so that's a very important part of the brain for when it comes to survival. And the prefrontal cortex is the largest in human brains. It exists in other animals, but it's the largest in human brains. And that is where we make decisions, where we have our impulse control, where we do our, quote unquote thinking. And so one of his first points was around, like I said, stress, and how stress actually grows the amygdala and inhibits the prefrontal cortex. So basically, you have on one hand the things like cortisol pumping into the brain, and how that decreases the activity in your impulse control area and increases size and neuron activity in your archaic brain, and where you control, where your fear is released and things like that. So we'll start with there, just again with that premise that stress is a super important thing. This is where he related back to baboon activity and how he would study that in that environment. So what are your thoughts on that first premise?
So it'd been a while since I listened to the Sapolsky episode. You just re-listened to it though, correct?
Yeah.
After So
Yep.
so you're bringing up some points that I admit I didn't quite remember. So essentially the premise, I'm just going to make sure, is that the more stress you experience, the more it grows your amygdala, or your more reptilian brain, I think, as you kind of said it,
Mm-hmm.
and inhibits your prefrontal cortex, which means your actions are much more reactionary to things than potentially what you're actually thinking about and deciding to do, which is where he's making the argument that we don't have as much free will as much as we have reactions to our upbringing and our stressors and our things we experience, right? That's kind of the
Yeah,
premise.
precisely. I think that's a great way to put it. Reaction versus a thoughtful response.
Okay, and
Yep.
everything. And so I'm thinking back to when I did listen to that episode, because it was great, was that he's basically saying that none of our actually, I think he is making the argument that really none of our actions are our own choosing, as much as they are predetermined by something we experienced or something we're reacting to, some like preset kind of set of variables that are making us do everything we do, right? So I don't know. That's I mean, I have a lot of thoughts, but it does take me down sort of the uh, into some of the paths of what Max Bennett said on the intelligence side. So I'm gonna hold off on saying a lot more until I see where you go next.
Okay.
How about that?
All right, that's fair. Let's do it then. One interesting thing that Sapolsky noted in this part of the show was that 25% of death row inmates have had a traumatic brain injury, and essentially that means that most of them, they do know right from wrong, but that they can't control their impulses. And in an earlier episode when we discussed identity, we talked about some examples of traumatic brain injury and how that's impacted people, uh, again, from the, from a legal system standpoint, just from a behavioral standpoint. And one famous example was Phineas Gage, and how he had a metal rod driven through his brain and instantly cauterized his brain, but just totally obliterated his prefrontal cortex, and how he survived, but was a completely different person, and all his impulse control was gone. He became a very belligerent, mean, just really short person with his family and friends, and so they didn't even recognize him afterwards. And so that's he gave some examples like that, and then led to the death row inmate example. And I think that's a pretty high number for it to be just a coincidence that, again, people that have had injuries to their prefrontal cortex then have led them to do some pretty terrible things. And so I think that was an interesting example there. Another thing he was talking about was stress at a very young age impacts cortisol production later in life. So even at a young age, the frontal cortex grows more slowly if exposed to more stress hormones early in life. And even fetal exposure to the mother's stress leads to a smaller frontal cortex and larger amygdala. So again, just showing that, to your point, the number of layers of circumstances that lead to the available universe of choices that you have is almost infinite. So you're talking about not only as a young child, your levels of stress, and again, coming from environment for one, if you are being well cared for, if you are in a situation where you have all your needs met, or if they're not, for example, that can lead to a lot of stress or not as much stress. And then even, like I said, to the fact that if your mother, while she's pregnant with you, undergoes a lot of stress or is exposed to factors that would lead to changes in your development as a fetus, then that can impact the size of different parts of your brain, and therefore the number of the types of choices that you can make later on, because you might be vastly predisposed to making those fight or flight choices when in reality the choices might not be so dramatic. But the way your brain interprets those signals gives you a limited number of options, whereas as someone who didn't have as much stress, as much cortisol in their system at an early age, might be a little more chill, might have a little more time to think and process the incoming signals and then make different sorts of choices.
So what's interesting there is that takes me back to that brass episode we just did recently. We were
Mm.
talking about trauma that's carried down through generations and things like that. So this is
Mm-hmm.
kind of the underlying science to that. And I'm going to argue we were predetermined to talk about this in this episode because we already talked about that in the previous episode. So this is just it's playing out in real time here.
It's all connected, man. Absolutely. Yeah, and that actually is funny because that was my next note on this was the epigenetic impact from trauma to parents or grandparents could affect you and your brain structure and future decision making. So again, going right back to what you were saying and what we talked about in previous episodes, where it's it's not just the things you do, the things you think, but and again, epigenetics is not the actual genes that you have. It's not literally changing your DNA, but there are markers that change how your genes behave. So it's just changing gene behavior, not the actual genes themselves. But that's enough to say uh, that you could behave differently in a given situation because your genes are either turned on or off, or behave in a different way based on the environment or effects of being in certain situations that your parents or grandparents had. So that trauma could be passed down for sure. That leads to his one of his biggest points that he was making, is that there's no separation between nature and nurture. There's really no what's the word I'm looking for here, no valid argument that really can separate those two things. There's been a lot of over the years discussion of which is more impactful, nature or nurture. Some people have made the argument that it's all one or all the other, that you're just definitely born a certain way and that's it, versus no, it's all about your choices in your environment and the things you're exposed to once you're born. But his argument is that there's no separation between the two, and the two are so intertwined that it's pointless to even argue any kind of lever going one way or the other.
Because you're going to get a certain amount of stuff handed down through your genes, and then you're also going to
Mm-hmm.
experience a certain amount of things, and both of those are going to work together to kind of form who you are, and
Yeah.
for that reason there's no reason to separate them.
Yeah, exactly. It's pointless to try to say it's 60-40 or 90-10 or whatever. It's just there's just so much involved in both of those. And the more we really look into that, I think it's very true, because like we've been saying, the number of factors out there, even before you're born, let alone after you're born, are just almost infinite. When you think about going back to, again, to riff off the Max Bennett piece, from how our nervous system developed in the first place, which was, again, just about surviving and reproducing, and then being able to figure out a way to move more efficiently, and then going from that to developing memory, to studies around rats and how they can understand regret if they made one choice versus making another choice, and then regretting that choice they made. Like, all those building blocks have led up to how our brain is structured now. And there's just something so powerful about evolutionary change and how that's baked into our brains and then baked into our current decision making, that I think it's easily overlooked. We just take for granted that, oh, where we are now is where we are now. But there's a reason that our brains are structured the way they are. And those evolutionary forces are so powerful in getting us from A to Z. And now that we're at Z, I think it's, again, pretty easy to just overlook that and say, oh, well, I mean, this is all we know because this is how we are. But there's so many deeply instinctual and structural reasons for why we are the way we are that I think it's important not to overlook that.
Yeah, there's one thing that so you made me think about a couple things there, and I'm thinking back to the Max Bennett episode. So when you talk about that evolution from like surviving and reproducing to movement to memory, and I was even thinking of he was describing the situation with like the sea anemone, where it brings in the idea of like our what we experience through our various senses, and he's like the sea anemone really only has touch. It doesn't have sight and so it's 100% reactionary to as stuff swims by and it feels it tries to grab it and it eats it. So it
Mm-hmm.
can't be discerning on what it eats. It has to try to grab whatever it, and I guess unless I don't know, maybe it has taste too. Maybe it spits it out if it doesn't like whatever it grabs. You know what I mean? But
Mm-hmm.
just that basic, like the most basic thing was how do I get energy? How do I get food to sustain me? And then that kind of movement there. So it's like that whole evolutionary process starts with the amygdala, and then at some point, as we develop over time, it brings that prefrontal cortex into play more. And you got to think that's probably where different species started to separate. But then he also talked about how close we are. I mean, it's that age old thing of like, well, we're only so many, such percentage away from, our ape counterparts, chimpanzees and baboons, back to the
Mm-hmm.
Sapolsky thing. And then the other thing he talked about was how the biggest difference, which kind of gets to something else we talked about recently too, was he said the biggest difference between species really and how they developed was language. And I know in a
Mm-hmm.
previous one, again, not being a neuroscientist or not being but I said I thought the biggest difference was not so much language because they say dolphins have a pretty actually do have a pretty intricate language and how they in the noises they make and how they communicate with each other, but more things like to the movement piece, not having thumbs where you can grab things and fingers where you can build things, and things like that. But his argument was it really is language, and that's what differentiated a lot of those species, especially in terms of kind of carrying on that knowledge then down through generations. So I thought that was interesting, tying those things together. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah. Another aspect too, which I just thought of now, is which was memory, and so that for him, I think, was the third stage. And if you think about that too, I believe he was talking about memory being stored in different parts of the brain, and then certain things being able to activate memories in a more powerful way. So if you have smell associated with a memory, and then you smell something like that years later, it'll just trigger that memory out of the blue. So tied into the free will stuff, if let's say you have a memory system that isn't quite as efficient, or you don't have positive memories associated with certain stimulus, then I could see how that is also tied into, again, the universe of choices that you have when it comes down to that moment when you do need to make a choice, and whether that's actually of your own free will, or if it's just, again, another component of what you remember or what you associate with a certain memory, or if you can even associate a particular thing with a memory of it. So, we were talking about in that brass episode, mice experiments where they were exposed to a room, and then 10 seconds in, they get exposed to a smell, and then they get a shock on their feet. Some people may not have that sort of negative reference of a smell being associated with something painful, and then not even have the ability to make a choice, for example, of avoiding danger, if they don't recognize those two things are connected. So, again, that's just another component of there just being so many things at play when it comes to the choices that we have and the outcomes from said choices, whether you do believe in free will or not. I think you have to recognize that even something like memory can be a piece that plays into a choice later on in life.
Well, yeah, I think well, that brings up a question of, I think Sapolsky might argue that's maybe not a choice, right?
Right. Well,
Like
exactly.
you,
Yeah.
hmm, yeah, that's interesting. I kind of really go both ways on that process, and I'd love to take credit for that mice thing, but I think that was actually Max Bennett in the episode. So he was talking about the mice in the room and the shock thing, but
Oh, that was.
uh,
Oh, they also talked in that in the Star Talk episode that we referenced
okay.
before too. Yeah.
Oh, all right. My bad there.
Yeah, in that one specific experiment, anyway, because he was talking a lot about rats. Max Bennett was talking a lot about rat experiments as well. But I think those two things might be from different episodes. But anyway, yeah, that's
Hey guys, we listen to lots of stuff, and sometimes we
yeah,
can't ourselves remember what exactly we heard where. um,
yeah, totally.
yeah. So and I know, like you mentioned, we had a prior conversation probably after this Sapolsky episode, before we started this podcast, about whether or not free will is a thing or not, and whether or not we have it. I know we both kind of, I don't know if we firmly fell on different sides of it, but we had some little bit different perspectives. And I think one of the things I got to thinking about, as you kind of just teed up that this would be maybe the topic for this, this episode, was whether we have it and whether we necessarily use it.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, like, I think a lot of people, I don't mean this in any way negative, but a lot of people are very habitual. You know what I mean? They go through the same motions, things all the time, and like, hey, this process I figured out works, and whatever it is, how you get up in the morning, how you get ready for the day, how you make your coffee, whatever it is, you find something that works, and you kind of then stick to it. Sometimes people stick to it just because it's the way they've always done it. They're not interested in if there's a better way to do it or not. They're just comfortable in that this is how I do it. Not big on change. And so, is that just a kind of, in a way, I'll use the word choice, not to exercise more free will into experimenting into other things? Um, I don't know, but
Yeah.
I think one thing I mentioned when we talked about it before was, I wonder if, to me, it kind of feels like maybe free will being exercised is when you do something that goes against what your instincts maybe initially tell you to do. You know what I mean? Like, for example, someone who goes for a walk and walks the same route every day, you know what I mean? And then that one day they go, hey, you know what? I'm going to go this other way. And so there they actually maybe made a free will choice versus just kind of falling in that same habit that they always otherwise would. So I think there's different degrees at different times of whether maybe people exercise it. Different people maybe exercise it more than others. People who are real, like, I'm always looking for something new, some new adventure, something, they may be exercising it a little more. And I wonder I wonder if that ties back to some other personality trait that then says, I'm going to do this or I'm not going to do it. Like I said, people who don't like change maybe are less likely to exercise that, than others that are always looking for something new. What do you think?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. So I thought of three different things. One, I'll list the things first so I don't forget. One is that I think humans are inherently pattern recognition people or beings, and so I think that falls into pattern that works, and so produces results in a certain way, and that can be good enough. So they stick with that pattern. The other thing is about something that Bennett said when regarding artificial intelligence and how they had a plateau with that process, and once artificial intelligence again programmed to behave a certain way would find a solution to a problem, it would just stick with it. So they actually had to program in curiosity, which was then finding other ways, more potentially more optimal ways, potentially less optimal ways, but the curiosity to actually pursue other solutions even after finding one solution that worked. So that was something that had to be deliberately programmed in to modern artificial intelligence. And the third thing is to your last point about could there be other things that would lead one to find a routine and just stick with it. And I think those things are things like, in my own example, I have later in my notes, I can dive into this now. I had a religious upbringing. Yeah, I was Catholic from birth to around 18, but I was also encouraged to read a lot, encouraged to ask questions, encouraged to think logically. My parents did a great job of instilling those values in me and giving me opportunities to read a lot of different things and encouraging me to just be curious. And so I think if it wasn't for those things, they may still have a son who's religious and, follows a certain moral doctrine and still reads the Bible, etc. I don't. I'm an agnostic atheist now. But if it wasn't for those combination of things, I probably wouldn't have asked those questions. I probably wouldn't have sought answers and, satisfactory answers in my own life and that relate to me in a certain way. And so I ended up changing my mind and switching my outlook on life. And so I think that applies to what you were talking about, in that I think people that maybe aren't as curious or didn't have an opportunity to choose their own reading material, didn't think about asking tough questions early in life, maybe have less impetus than to seek a different way, seek a different path, to turn left instead of always turning right on that walk. So I think those are, yeah, that's a very interesting, kind of thing to look at, because yeah, I think a lot of those things, again, that just shows how many different things can play into a simple decision to turn left or right on a walk that you go on every single day. So let's see. So another couple notes that I had was around culture and how, so this is more of the nurture aspect of things. We already discussed a lot around nature, and when it comes to nurture, the cultural pieces that Sapolsky talked about were very interesting. Certain cultures lead to monotheism versus polytheism. Certain cultures develop a warrior class and a culture of honor and revenge, with, let's say, like pastoral nomads, for example, and herders versus the farming or forest societies that live in rainforests, for example, where they are more, hunters and gatherers. And so that is another aspect of how centuries and centuries and centuries of past cultural elements then can also, and do also, then impact even us as modern humans. Cultural differences impact how you're raised early on as well, collectivism versus individualism, and that further impacts brain development. He gave some examples around certain cultures are more likely to, the mothers will sing lullabies to their children growing up, or try to get them to be individual and independent beings much earlier than other societies. Things like raising children collectively versus, again, that individualistic society, which is more of like the modern American society, where everything's, you're taught to be independent, you're taught to be, you achieve things on your own, and everything is a personal accomplishment, etc. I think that cultural and societal impact is a huge piece of things as well. What do you think?
Yeah, the first thing I thought of as you were talking about the teaching our offspring, I guess, our children to
Mm-hmm.
be more independent, is I thought back to the kind of the animal. We mentioned in a previous conversation about what maybe we're all just animals in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Most animals do that, right? Their whole goal is to essentially get that animal to survive, or their offspring to survive, so that they can go be independent. And some species kind of herd up and sort of stay together in that family unit. But I mean, it's really get independent as soon as you can. Learn, get walking, get finding food.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing I kind of thought of when you said that too is I feel like our maybe in our society we're starting to get away from that idea that teaching our kids to be independent. You hear more and more about kids having a harder time getting away from home, which
Mm-hmm.
I want to clearly state I'm not passing judgment on that either way, because I think every situation is different. I think we've talked, man, things are getting, I think it's getting harder and harder for kids to start off on their own in society. The cost of housing, the cost of everything.
Hmm.
A lot of people that don't want to support higher wages and things, so people can get out and earn a living and get the same start that maybe we did, or especially our parents' generation. So I
Yeah.
kind of see a little bit of shift in our society there, but that's kind of off the topic, I guess. I could definitely see where, to your point, that cultural upbringing does probably lead to a certain path. But I also wonder if within those cultures, um, I'm going back to your curiosity idea, how much of that is supported, and it might have depended on where that culture was in its evolution, right?
Mm.
So I even think back to pre-industrial revolution time in the US, where you pretty much people had jobs, but a lot of people just farmed. You know what I mean? They had their own little farm. That's what they did. That farm wouldn't survive. It wouldn't go on if you as the offspring didn't continue,
Hmm.
to carry it on. And I think that's probably an extension of those earlier, hunter gatherer cultures. And so there probably wasn't a lot of, like, if you varied off that path, you might be signaling the end of your of your little of your family unit or tribe.
Yeah.
So I think there's you know probably less room to deviate, but again, that might be just part of the whole our cultural evolution as a human species.
Yeah.
I hope any of that made sense. I feel like I kind of went all
Yeah.
over the place.
That's what we do.
Yeah.
Also thinking about how the pendulum, swings back and forth over time. Another aspect of something that I was thinking about was more the prevalence of intergenerational living arrangements. So, whether it be financially or health related, but parents living with their parents and their children. So you've got three generations living together for various reasons, or you have, we're kind of in this time right now where the baby boomer generation is such a huge percentage of our total population, and now they're getting to the point where they need extra care. They're starting to get to those advanced years, and I think that's why one of the reasons why you're seeing that is just the prevalence of an aging large portion of our population. And so I think that's why the pendulum might be swinging in that direction. But that's, I think that's another aspect again of how a culture might evolve on a micro level versus the macro level, which I think is more, your examples were more on the macro level, I think. But yeah, that could just be another, 30-40 year type swing in one direction, and then potentially swinging back. And another thing I thought of too, you brought up maybe more, not specifically, but kind of that opportunity and maybe middle class sort of situation. And I was thinking about at the end of World War II, how so many people, so many young men and went off to war in Europe and Asia, and then came back and had access to the GI Bill and other benefits. And so they were able to go to school, or they learned a trade in the military. And so they were able to get a great start on, just launching themselves into that middle class life. Not that I want another massive war to set us up for another situation like that, but I think that's an example of how an entire generation was able to get that little bit of a boost. I mean, they made major sacrifices in even the women and children that were left behind and had to deal with filling in the jobs in factories and making sacrifices in terms of rationing and things like that to help the war effort. But through that kind of that trauma, there was also a boost in opportunity and being bumped up into the middle class for an entire generation of Americans. So I think that can swing both ways, but also shows that there are certain factors, that can impact just total opportunities for an entire generation.
Yeah, and that's kind of converse to, I don't want to go too far down this one, but we talked about too in that, I think in the brass episode was, you know, the negative impacts of like slavery and Reconstruction and all those things having
Mm-hmm.
potentially the opposite impacts on, or not, I shouldn't say the opposite, but as much as that had a positive impact on everybody at the time, or most people, but again, even during that time, there was still time the Civil Rights Act and things like that. So it was a it goes both ways, right?
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of an experience of one generation of within a species, then having that kind of trickle down positive and or negative effect on those that come after it.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, what you're talking about is that multi-generational trauma and repression and denial of opportunity, and how that can affect across generations, but within a specific group of people. And yeah, so I think that's a great example of, yeah, things that can be positive in one example and detrimental, negative for another group. So that's, yeah, that's huge.
That's one of those things I think we as a society just don't pay enough attention to, right? Is all those little things that do poke at our species and affect it in ways like, I think we've talked before, I've said this a few times, that in other conversations with other people too, that I think, we as a human species have gone through such a significant change in the last 100 years. And I'm 100, give or take, but I mean, going back to the
Right.
Industrial Revolution, we've since invented automobiles, computers, uh, smartphones, the internet,
Social media.
social media. That's all kind of down a similar path, but let's even go to like office jobs,
Mm-hmm.
a daily commute in an automobile, all these things that
Suburbs.
yeah, you name it, suburbs, massive cities. I mean, they were getting
Yeah.
pretty big, back then. But and what I think we've done is we've introduced all this massive change to ourselves as a species. And my understanding of evolution um, is that no individual organism within a given species actually changes. It's just certain organisms within that species are what's the word I'm looking for? Like more adapted or set up a certain way
Mm-hmm.
to accept that change or not. And then as the
Mm-hmm.
change is introduced, certain part of the species dies off, the other part of the species becomes more prolific, is able to survive, and the species as a whole changes because that organism, or that set of organisms that has those certain traits that makes it more suited to that, then carries on, and then another change will come along, and you'll see a similar change in the entire population of the species, but no individual organisms actually really evolve and adapt, right? It's always
Right.
as things change. So now what we've done is we've introduced all this change, and I think, when we talk about trauma, mental health issues, all those things, I don't think we give enough credit or attention to the idea that some of us are in the wrong end of that evolutionary change. We've put so much stress now into our against us as living animals and organisms, that some people just aren't ready for it, right? And
Right.
those are the ones that are gonna suffer, while some are more adapted to it and are gonna succeed. But I have to wonder if it's happening so fast that less are ready for it. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And I think that's why we've got a lot of just unrest, division, because in some cases, you know, leaders are coming in and trying to promise you solutions to problems that maybe they don't have. You know what I
Mm-hmm.
mean? But we're each looking for that path to happiness and solutions, and that's causing people to really separate. Because that's another thing I had to think about when you mentioned like the war effort, was just how united everybody was. Right? Everybody was working towards a common goal and could see that could see that end goal and was doing their part. You couldn't get people to unite like that now if you wanted to. I don't think. I hope I'm wrong, but
Yeah. Yeah. Well, then that also makes me think, not just evolution or the universe of choices based on trauma, but also then just based on what we're presented with every day. So, we always, I think we've all heard about attention spans being very, changed in the recent years, with the type of media that's out there, with social media, with the sort of the way that content is presented to us. And I think that's one based on recognizing that's how people's brains are right now, or a way to manipulate those our brains. But then also, is that something that isn't necessarily something you would classify maybe as trauma, but just a modern behavior of the brain? And so is that something that could impact evolution too, where based on how you handle short bursts of information and how your mind processes that and puts some in short-term memory and then some in long-term memory, but gets rid of, maybe accidentally some important information, versus those that can just take that, process it, and file things away in the correct manner that'll be useful to them later. Those types of behaviors could be accelerated. And then I wonder if the way the brain evolves to handle those situations as they are, could that be accelerating too? And then just based on the technology that we have now, is that just something where we are drastically changing evolutionary patterns?
oh, very, very much so. I mean, I think technology, like kind of like we said a few minutes ago, is just one of those things that we're doing to ourselves. Right, we're introducing this massive change at a crazy rate, and then we're doing it, but then on the flip side, it's also affecting us.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's a great point. But I when you said that too about the attention and paying attention to things on our phones, and I think of all the people I see, just sitting there like watching their Instagram reels or whatever, and just can't look up from their phone and all this stuff. And I wonder that had me coming back around to like the free will thing. Like, is that attacking? Is that presentation of information essentially? And I used the word attacking. I don't know if that's what I wanted, but is it taking advantage of the fact, if Sapolsky is right, that a lot of us don't have free will or don't know how to exercise? We can't stop looking, right? This stuff's just
Hmm.
coming at me, and I know I should. I mean, I probably ought to put this thing down and go do something more productive, but I can't, because it's just this new stimulation. Every time I scroll up with my thumb, I see something, some new form of stimulation, and there's that
Hmm.
completely like reactionary chemical thing, that says I can't stop looking at it. you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that brings up two interesting things. I think one is, first is dopamine and how that's triggered when we experience something novel. So particularly, and that's very addictive. And so that exposure to novel things, we're always seeking out those more and more novel things. And then you also have just the distraction all the time. So I think that's essentially what we're saying there, is that that's a social media and other modern technology has resulted in just a boatload of distractions for us on either a second by second or day by day basis. And one thing that was very interesting that I noted down from that Spolsky episode was that you can't will yourself to have more willpower. So, and that ties in with his thoughts around meritocracy and punishment, which is that you're not special in any particular way, that your hard work or your grit or your determination is all you and special, and that you're better than someone else because you accomplish certain things. And then on the flip side, you're not to be blamed or shamed for having done something, maybe broken the law or done something bad, because in both cases, you don't have the free will to have done that on your own. You made choices, the only choice that you could make. And so that, to me, though, that you can't create more willpower through your own will is perfect for this situation that we're talking about now, because some people just can't scroll away or stop scrolling and move on to something else. It's just not a choice they have in their ability to make. So And I would also say, to not to bury the lead, because we're talking about free will overall here, agree mostly with what Robert Sapolsky is saying in that we don't have free will. But I can't quite fully get there. I feel like, and this is kind of to what you were saying earlier, that, and even Dax was saying on the episode, was that I feel like I'm at 95% of the way there, but I can't quite get to just saying it's black or white, free will or no free will. I'm at the point where I agree with most of what he's saying, and I think the number of factors are almost infinite, and just the number of connections between you and the rest of the world, your friends, your family, your coworkers, your environment, just the weather of the day, the number of neurons firing in your brain at any given time. All those things are factors that lead you to a choice, again, quote unquote choice. But I can get most of the way there, but I still think, I feel that there's still some universe of choices that you have. And now, universe may be a bad word because that implies something massive, but I'm saying maybe down to just two choices, even, or two or three choices.
It's more like a subset of choices.
Yeah, yeah,
Like
precisely.
things have been filtered down so much for you through
Hmm.
certain things that you can control or not control, but at the end of it there is some level of choice.
Yeah.
Like I was thinking of like an extreme example of like I don't, I could walk out my door and go, I'm going to fly through the air like a bird by my free will of choice. Oh no, wait a minute. I'm limited in that I can't do that because I don't have wings. You know what I mean? And so that's a thing that's already determined for me and takes that choice away from me. And I
Hmm.
know that's an extreme example, but what I did think along those same lines of exactly what you're saying was there's this pathway that you kind of follow through these predetermined things, and then at the end, maybe there's some small choices we get to make.
Yeah.
Fully understand too that the idea of whether or not we have free will is going to poke at a lot of like fundamental essence of who some people think they are. You know what I
Hmm.
mean? And so that actually got me thinking of so I believe it was yesterday's Bulwark podcast with Timothy Snyder. He's the author who wrote On Tyranny a few years back. There's
Hmm.
been a lot of reference to that. Now he's wrote a book called On Freedom. And he kind of poked at this a little bit with the idea of libertarianism. I think what he was getting at is you may have to have some government involvement in things in order to have more freedom to then be truly more free and express your libertarian beliefs. So like I think the example might have been healthcare.
Hmm.
If there was in countries with government run healthcare, hey, people have different opinions on it. Just look at the statistics. That's all I'm saying, right? If you don't have to worry about that, oh geez, I fell down and I twisted my ankle. I'm just going to go to the doctor. It's covered. I'm going to walk out. I'm going to get better. It's not going to financially break me. Then I now in that system probably have a level of freedom that maybe I don't have here, where whether or not I can go in that doctor's office is maybe determined by whether or not I have benefits through my job
Hmm.
and things like that. So that made me think about like the idea of free will versus or how it aligns with the idea of freedom.
Hmm.
So if along those same lines, like if you have a lot of things restricting you and getting in your way, like for example, from a healthcare standpoint, I have some choice, right? I can choose to go to a doctor. Now, okay, let me back up. Ultimately, I have the choice. If I want to go to any doctor I want and I want to pay that much money to, go to whatever doctor I want and just pay the bill, which is going to be massively expensive. So, I'd love to be in that situation, but I'm not. So therefore,
Hmm.
my set of choices that's already predetermined for me is my benefits say I can go to this network of doctors, right? So now I get to make that little choice, that subset of choices, like we were just talking
Hmm.
about a minute ago, of which doctor do I want to choose of this network that's already been predetermined for me.
Yep.
So I have a level of free will or freedom as predetermined by some other entity that's said, here's your choices, right?
Yep.
So I don't know. I didn't quite tie that together as well as I wanted to, but
No,
maybe I
I
get
get
the
it.
idea.
Yeah, no, it's that free will or the illusion of free will, but in a practical cultural application of it. And so, yeah, so there's microcosms of the macro debate on free will within our day-to-day lives like that. So, yeah, no, I think that's a good example. Um, yeah, so there's so much more from those episodes that I think we could get into. I mean, I think we covered it pretty well. I think we gave a good accounting of at least what inspired us to explore this topic further. And again, I think it sounds like we both come out in a pretty similar spot on it. I think Sapolsky would say, to us that last 5 or 10%, that's just magic, and it has to be black or white. It has to be no free will or free will. And he comes down on the side of there is no free will because of just the sheer number of interconnected things that lead up to every single individual choice, again, quote unquote choice that we feel we're making. Whereas I would come down with there's a subset of choices, even though it may be literally limited down to just 2 choices that you could make in any given situation. I still feel like there's room for some agency there. So I think this is going to be an eternal debate.
Yeah, don't you get the feeling? And again, I'm thinking back to when I did listen to that Sapolsky episode that maybe he might have been acting as a little bit of an instigator, and he wants you to kind of think about it and talk
Yeah.
about it,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Like
He's poking at you.
yeah, he's proposing a viewpoint based on his observations, but he wants to inspire conversation. I don't know if I felt that Bennett Max Bennett did as much, but I will say he was a very
Mhm.
entertaining. Like he was a great conversationalist, and so like if you
Yeah.
just read his book or listened to his book, which I don't think he reads because I did look it up on, the look at the audiobook.
Mm.
You wouldn't get that. You wouldn't get that from just his book. That's where the podcast interview format really does help. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? With kind of provoking thought, and to your
Yeah.
point, I think this was a fun discussion about it. Like you said, kind of in the whole setup to this is what we like to do: find interesting things, explore them further. We're not experts, but we like to toss it around in our brains and
Yeah.
see what comes out. We might not have answers at the end, but we had a heck of a discussion along the way.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Definitely had fun doing it. So I think we'll leave it there and hope you guys also had some interesting thoughts and takeaways, and this will make you think a little bit. And we definitely encourage you to check out those 2 episodes from Armchair Expert and give them a follow, give them a listen. Always interesting stuff going on over there. So thanks to those guys for inspiring this conversation. All right, everybody. Well, have a great week and we'll see you next time.